What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch and I finally have something to talk about again when it comes to Camelot Unchained. For a while there was a bit of an info drought and I have to say it's becoming really difficult to make any content about Camelot Unchained. But there are a few things that I actually do want to talk about, so I'm going to do that in the next couple of weeks. And then hopefully we will be in their so-called summer of streaming and there will be a lot more info to divulge and talk about so that I can get back on that Camelot Unchained train. And then we hopefully at some point will get the beta. And then of course I will have lots and lots and lots of stuff to talk about. So at the beginning of this specific stream, there was a PSA where they basically advised us to consider upgrading to Windows 10 for the future. They promised we won't need Windows 10 to run it, so it's not going to be a Windows 10 exclusive. There is going to be support for older Windows systems. However, because Windows 10 is Microsoft's newest flagship, it is pretty reasonable to assume that they are going to stop supporting the older Windows versions at some point in the not too distant future. Just like they did with all the other old Windows systems. Now, I'm personally not the biggest fan of Windows 10 because it is a little bit too spy-y for my taste, and there's a couple of problems with drivers that keep cropping up, and I also don't like Microsoft's move for a lot of Windows 10 exclusive video game titles. And they still haven't gotten rid of the app system. Microsoft, you are not making an operating system for a smartphone. But beyond that, CSE is definitely not wrong suggesting that you should upgrade to Windows 10 at some point, because yeah, it is going to be the future. There's not really much you can do about it. So the only choice you really have when it comes to Windows 10 is whether or not you want it for free, which means you get it right now, or if you want it when all the bugs and kinks are worked out, which means probably waiting another year or two. But now let us move on to the meat and potatoes of this particular stream, which was their announcement that they have hired a total of 4 new programmers, raising their total programmers from 9 to 13, which is pretty significant. That's an increase in programmers of almost 50% after all. So that should definitely do something for the speed at which they can actually finish stuff. Now they couldn't, however, find these 4 programmers anywhere near Fairfax, where the CSE headquarters is located, and instead they have hired these 4 programmers in Seattle. And eventually they want to have an office in Seattle that will then be sort of a satellite office of CSE. Now to all you non-Americans, I entirely feel for you because I also had no friggin' idea where Seattle is. So let's take a quick look at the map. This right here is Fairfax, Virginia, where the City State Entertainment headquarters are located. And all the way over here on the northwestern coast of the United States is Seattle. So as you can see, that is entirely on the other side of the country. The problem they've had since the beginning is that it is really difficult to find developers who are willing to move to Virginia because the biggest video game developing hubs in the United States are in Seattle, Los Angeles, and Austin, Texas. But now with a virtual and soon hopefully physical satellite office, they should have a much easier time getting more programmers for the team. Doing all of this is of course not cheap, but the team did not want to go out and get more money from us backers, so Mark Jacobs and the other shadowy mystery investor have both put more capital into the project to ensure that this can happen. One of the consequences of this is also going to be that there are not going to be any more stretch goals for now. Seeing how this was already announced with the Beta 1 delay stream, I'm thinking that this new version of that particular point might mean that we're not going to see any stretch goals until the game releases. I'm not 100% certain about this, but that's how it sounded to me. Now, I personally have no problem with that because I don't necessarily think that stretch goals are going to make the game all that much better at this point. At this point, what the game needs is a bloody release date. And so if they're going to invest any new funding into getting more programmers so that the game can be shipped earlier, I'm entirely happy with that. Now the sad bit of the stream is that there was no definitive announcement on the Beta 1 release date. I'm a little bit upset about that because I was really hoping for a Beta 1 release date at last, but here we are and we're just gonna have to deal with it. As is customary with CSE streams, there was also a small Q&A section where various community questions were answered. And the first thing we have gleaned is that this increase in programmers is not a definitive thing. The team is still looking for more programmers, but now they have 2 locations where they can recruit. Next, we've learned that none of the previous employees of the company are going to move to Seattle. The main goal is still to have as many employees as possible in the headquarters for easier communication. The satellite studio in Seattle is really more of a solution to a problem than something that was desired by the team. Now, we didn't learn all too much about the ability system rework, only that the work on it is going relatively well. Now, what this means, I have no idea. Let's just hope that this means the beta will be in the next 1 or 2 months at the very latest. We will, however, get an update and sort of an info dump on abilities and components before the launch of Beta 1. So as soon as they are done reworking the ability system, they will let us know about all of the goodies that we can expect from the classes in Camelot Unchained. At first, we're probably only going to learn about the 3 classes that are going to be in Beta 1, i.e. the heavy fighters, archers, and healers, but during the so-called summer of streaming, we are probably also going to get some information about classes that come further down the line in Beta. As a little addendum to the last stream, one of the reasons why they actually ended up reworking the ability system was apparently that a fair amount of the abilities that Ben came up with didn't even work at all with the old system. And so a new system was necessary in order for all of the abilities to be implemented as they were designed. And this is interesting because this isn't something that came across in the other stream. In the other stream, it just seemed like the old system was really difficult and it would have been difficult to make everything work. But we didn't even really know that it actually limited design space. Now that I personally know that the old system put a hard limit on design space, meaning that certain things simply were impossible, I am even more in favor of the ability rework. So this was actually a great question to ask. Whoever asked it, I sadly forgot. There was a very interesting question about what state or robustness the client would be in for Camelot Unchained at the point of Beta 1 in relation to Warhammer Online and Dark Age of Camelot. And Mark's answer was that Camelot Unchained's client would be more robust than Dark Age of Camelot was when it went into closed beta, but not as robust as Warhammer Online when it went into closed beta. Now this may cause uproar if misunderstood because of how Warhammer Online launched. Remember that this is Beta 1, so the very first time the game went into beta, and this of course also goes for Warhammer Online and Dark Age of Camelot. And I know the state Warhammer Online went into beta with, and it actually looked really good in beta. The problem with Warhammer Online was always that it wasn't finished when it launched. It was never that it went into beta before it was ready. There were a number of questions concerning the Summer of Streaming event, so I'm going to sum those up now. Firstly, to all of you who love to watch Michelle make art for Camelot Unchained, there are in fact going to be more streams with her during the Summer of Streaming. The Summer of Streaming will also include update streams on content and gameplay. And thank the gods, because I need this to happen really badly. I need stuff to actually talk about. So I'm immensely looking forward to this because it's finally going to give me the opportunity to really talk about Camelot Unchained again. And then lastly, somebody asked why Camelot Unchained cannot be streamed or have made videos about it right now. Why we have to wait for the beta. And apparently the reason is that they want to focus more on making a traditional game. Mark didn't say traditional, but that is pretty much what he's talking about. And you know what, I'm actually going to go on a little bit of a tangent about this. The problem I have with Crowfall and a lot of the other sort of crowd-funded early access MMOs that are in the making at the moment is that they all show a lot of their gameplay. But the problem is that yes, they do show a lot of their gameplay, but it also does feel a little bit like they are working on making the playable part better. It just feels like they are adding things to the playable part instead of just building their game and having that be accessible. You might think that isn't a big difference, but it is definitely a big difference, because if you just make your game and then make certain builds of the game available, you can keep working on the actual game and get feedback on some of the stuff that's already in, while you are still building a lot of other systems and you're just going forward with the work. If you put the game out there, have people play it, and then react on whatever feedback they give you, it is going to take a lot longer to finish the game, because you are responding to their feedback directly. This feature is broken, and then you fix that feature, that turns the entire development of your game into a very reactionary sort of thing. And in essence, what this means is that, yes, while Crowfall is already playable currently, it could very much be the case that Camelot Unchained still ends up launching quicker than Crowfall because of how much Crowfall focuses on improving the playable client instead of just finishing the game. And this is definitely a problem that I have with the early access genre and all of this crowdfunding stuff. You only need to look at DayZ to see what can happen. that game is dead. That game is never going to launch. It is always going to be an alpha, and it's always just going to have little incremental tiny content updates to what is basically a broken game. Okay, you are never going to see DayZ in a finished state that gets regular content updates or anything like that. It's always going to be the broken ass piece of crap that it is now. Sure, it's going to get incremental content updates, but the base game is going to be broken for years to come. That game is basically in maintenance mode, and why is that? Well, because they have sold over 4 million copies already. They made a huge amount of money on the game. There simply is no incentive for them to actually finish it. And that is exactly what ended up happening. And another example of this is Ark. Now, Ark is beloved by many people, but the thing is, the basic game of Ark is super broken and super alpha. The animations are crap, a lot of features are broken and janky, but all they are doing is adding a bunch of new content every month. Instead of actually just sitting down and fixing all the problems and finishing the game and polishing it up, they're just content at sitting there and just adding new bits and bobs to what really isn't a finished game yet. And yes, I do think Crowfall is absolutely running that risk. I'm not saying it's going to happen to them, but this sort of thing has happened to other studios that had real big ambitions on how quickly they want to finish their game. Well over a year ago, for example, Killing Floor 2 went into early access, and they proclaimed loudly in a video with Total Biscuit that they had a rigid plan on launching the game in 6 months, and it would be finished then, and all they need is a little bit of extra money. And over a year later, that game is far from finished, because they have also jumped into this thing of just adding in more content, but not actually finishing the basic game. Now again, I'm not saying Crowfall is going to end up like this, and I'm certainly also going to start taking a look at Crowfall soon, but the way they are developing their game absolutely opens them up to this possibility. And if City State can avoid this by driving a very old school regimented beta, I'm actually fine with that, because it opens up the possibility of receiving a finished Camelot Unchained at some point. Alright, tangent over, but there were a few more general questions that were asked during the livestream. Firstly, somebody asked about the map state, and Mark once again confirmed that whenever the game launches fresh, only the main island and maybe a few others will be in possession of each of the factions, but the majority of the map will be broken up into small islands that belong to no one. And so it is up to the players to go out and conquer these lands for their faction, which will then fuse them together into larger chunks of land and create the game world that can be fought over. There has also not been a change on the philosophy of the PvE in Camelot Unchained. There will not be any PvE leveling whatsoever, or any regimented PvE, but non-PvP activities will absolutely be in the game. Now I gotta say though, it did kind of feel like Mark was dodging the question slightly. I'm probably gonna have to ask him about this at some point. Because the actual question was if there were going to be big boss monsters that we can fight. It wasn't necessarily if we can level on boss monsters or if they're going to drop a bunch of loot, but just if there's going to be really big, cool sort of raid bosses, if you will. Dragons and giants and all that sort of thing. And Mark didn't specifically reply to that. He talked about there not being any leveling or any regimented content, and then sort of dodged it by talking about crafting and the depths, but there wasn't really any specific talk about big boss monsters. So I think I'm gonna have to do some digging on that at some point. But the main goal for Camelot Unchained is, as always, that there's not supposed to be any end game. The entire game is supposed to be the equivalent of the end game in other MMORPGs. And this is probably one of the things I'm excited for the most when it comes to Camelot Unchained. Now, I don't necessarily mind leveling, I just really hate questing. But if I don't have to do any leveling to do the things that I actually want to do, then all the better. So let's hope the summer of streaming commences soon, and let's hope that the beta won't be too far off, so that I can finally get into making more content. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.